Jonathan had dreamed of walking the paths of Scripture for years, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment his feet touched the stones of Jerusalem. The Holy Land was not just a place on a map, it was a living story. And as he entered its ancient gates, he felt as though time itself folded in on him. The air was thick with incense, prayers, and the whispers of centuries. Every corner seemed to carry echoes of the past, voices of prophets, cries of pilgrims, and the quiet steps of Christ himself. From the Garden of Gethsemane, where gnarled olive trees still stretch their roots into the soil of history, to the solemn shadows of Caiaphas' house, Jonathan's journey was more than sightseeing. It was an encounter. He traced the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, not as a tourist but as a pilgrim, carrying with him the weight of questions and the hope of finding answers. Standing at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he realized that the story of faith was not locked in stone. It was alive, breathing, and waiting to be rediscovered. His visit was not only a walk through history, but a step into transformation. Jonathan's journey through the Holy Land began in a place he had heard about since childhood, the Garden of Gethsemane, located at the foot of the Mount of Olives. The site was surprisingly small, nestled within stone walls and shaded by olive trees. The moment he entered, the noise of Jerusalem seemed to fade into the background. Instead of crowded markets and car horns, there was only the rustle of leaves and the quiet shuffle of pilgrims. The first thing Jonathan noticed were the trees themselves. Their trunks were twisted and gnarled, shaped by centuries of growth. The guide explained that while the upper branches were much younger, the roots of some of these olive trees were almost 2,000 years old. That meant the very life flowing through them today was connected to the same root systems that existed when Jesus prayed here. Jonathan found himself staring at one tree that seemed especially ancient. Its bark nodded in such a way that it almost looked like a human face. He reached out and touched the rough wood, thinking about how these trees had stood watch during one of history's most painful nights. As the group moved deeper into the garden, the guide read from the Gospel of Luke, Jesus kneeling in prayer, asking for the cup of suffering to be taken from him, sweating drops of blood, and finally submitting to the Father's will. Hearing those words in the very place they described made Jonathan shift uncomfortably. It was no longer just a story. It was geography, history, and faith colliding all at once. Their guide explained a Catholic tradition called offering up suffering. The idea that when believers endure pain, they can unite it spiritually with Christ's suffering. Jonathan had heard of this before, but never really thought about it. He remembered Archbishop Fulton Sheen's words, quoted by the guide, "The greatest fear in life isn't pain but death, and the way to face it is to prepare, to live daily with awareness of mortality." That idea, known as memento mori, had always struck Jonathan as strange, even a little morbid. But in the shadow of these ancient trees, it suddenly made sense. Remembering death was a way of remembering how precious life really was. Jonathan also recalled a personal experience. A few years earlier, he had gone through a painful neck surgery that left him bedridden for weeks. During that time, he felt useless and frustrated. But one night, kneeling by his daughter's bed, he decided to pray differently. Instead of asking God to take the pain away, he whispered, "I offer this for her." It was clumsy and emotional, but it gave him peace. Standing now in Gethsemane, he realized that was a small taste of what this garden was about, turning suffering into love. The group paused near a small chapel built on the site. From there, Jonathan could look out across the Kidron Valley toward the walls of Jerusalem. He pictured the scene 2,000 years earlier. Soldiers with torches climbing the hill, Judas stepping forward with a kiss, the disciples scattering in fear. The setting made it easier to understand the human side of the story. Jesus hadn't faced suffering in an abstract way. He had faced it in a real garden, on real soil, surrounded by real friends who fell asleep when he needed them most. Before leaving, the guide asked everyone to take a few minutes of silence. Jonathan sat on a low stone wall and closed his eyes. He thought about the times he had struggled, losses, disappointments, worries about the future. When the group finally exited the garden, Jonathan glanced back at the olive trees one more time. They stood tall and silent, as they had for centuries. He realized they weren't just markers of history. They were witnesses, still rooted in the soil of the past, yet alive in the present. His visit to Gethsemane had not erased his questions about suffering, but it had given him a new perspective. Pain was unavoidable, But it didn't have to be meaningless for Jonathan. The garden was no longer just a place in the Bible. It had become a mirror, asking him how he would face his own trials. Would he avoid them, or would he learn to whisper, as Jesus did, "Not my will, but yours"? After leaving the Garden of Gethsemane, Jonathan followed his group up toward Mount Zion. The walk itself was humbling. Narrow stone stairways climbed steadily upward, some so worn down by centuries of pilgrims that their centers dipped like shallow bowls. Their guide explained that these were first-century steps, the very road that connected the upper room, Gethsemane, and Caiaphas' residence. Jonathan stopped halfway up, running his hand over the cool limestone. The thought that Jesus himself had walked here the night of his arrest made his skin prickle. At the top of the climb stood the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, modern and well-kept on the outside. It was built over the ruins of what is believed to be Caiaphas' house. Jonathan wasn't sure what to expect. From a distance, the church looked like many others he had visited. Stained glass, an arched roof, and a cross rising against the Jerusalem sky. But stepping inside was different. The mosaics on the walls depicted the trial of Jesus, Peter's denial, and the guards mocking him. It wasn't just art. It was a reminder that this place had once been filled with anger, fear, and betrayal. The guide led the group down a staircase into the lower chambers. Jonathan felt the air grow cooler, damp with the scent of stone and earth. At the bottom was a pit, dark, silent, and empty now, but once used as a holding cell. Tradition holds that Jesus may have been kept here after his arrest. Jonathan leaned against the railing and looked down. The pit wasn't large, maybe the size of a small room, but its walls were rough and unwelcoming. He tried to imagine being lowered into it by rope, hands tied, surrounded by darkness. The guide asked the group to pause in silence. For a full minute, no one spoke. Jonathan could almost hear the shuffle of soldiers' boots, the echo of chains, and the faint cries of a prisoner waiting alone. It was sobering to think that in this very spot, Christ could have spent his last free hours before the cross, outside. The courtyard of the church offered another perspective. According to tradition, this was the place where Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. A statue of Peter stood there, with a rooster perched above to recall the gospel story. Jonathan walked slowly toward it, thinking of how quickly fear had overcome the disciple who once swore he would never abandon his master. The guide read aloud from Luke's gospel, Peter insisting, "I do not know him," and the rooster crowing just as Jesus turned to look at him. Jonathan could almost see it, the look on Peter's face as shame washed over him. He wondered what it must have felt like to lock eyes with Jesus at that moment, to realize instantly how far you had fallen. Jonathan sat on a bench near the statue and thought about how the story didn't end there. Peter's denial was not the end of his journey. Later, he would be forgiven and restored, even trusted to lead the early church. That contrast gave Jonathan hope. Failure, even public failure, wasn't final. Before leaving, Jonathan noticed an elderly woman from another tour group slowly descending the uneven steps barefoot. Concerned, he asked if she needed help. She shook her head firmly and whispered, "He walked them for me. I can walk them for him." Her determination left Jonathan speechless. It was a living testimony that faith wasn't just about remembering events, it was about responding with action, even in small personal ways. As Jonathan stepped back into the bright Jerusalem afternoon, he carried with him a new perspective. Caiaphas' house was no longer just an archaeological site. It was a reminder of weakness, but also of grace. He realized that the stones under his feet told both stories, of betrayal and denial, but also of forgiveness and second chances. And as he followed the group toward the Via Dolorosa, Jonathan couldn't help but ask himself, what would he do when tested? Would he, like Peter, stumble in fear, or would he find the courage to stand firm? From Caiaphas' house, Jonathan's group entered the old city of Jerusalem through narrow stone lanes that quickly became crowded. Vendors called out from stalls selling bread, fruit, and souvenirs. Children ran past, weaving between tourists. It was noisy, even chaotic. Yet somewhere beneath the everyday bustle ran the quiet weight of history. This was the path where Jesus carried his cross. The Via Dolorosa, Latin for Way of Sorrow, winds through the heart of the old city. 14 stations mark the traditional route of Christ's journey to Calvary. Jonathan had seen stations of the cross before, framed neatly in churches back home. But here, the stations were not pictures on a wall. They were embedded into the streets, carved into stone markers above doorways, or tucked between shops at the first station, where Pilate condemned Jesus to death. The group gathered in a small courtyard. Their guide read the gospel account of the trial. Around them, life went on as usual. Shoppers bargaining, carts rattling across cobblestones. Jonathan was struck by how ordinary the surroundings felt. He imagined it had been the same 2,000 years ago. Crowds busy with errands while, just steps away, history's most important trial unfolded. As they walked to the next stations, Jonathan found himself paying attention not just to the markers but to the act of walking itself. The streets were uneven, the stones slick from centuries of wear. Carrying a heavy cross on this terrain, after being scourged, must have been almost impossible. At the third station, where Jesus is said to have fallen for the first time, Jonathan looked down at the jagged stones and realized how easily it could have happened. One of the most moving stops came at the fourth station, Jesus meeting his mother. A small chapel marked the spot, and though the details are more tradition than archaeology, the moment felt deeply human. Jonathan thought of his own mother, how much strength and comfort she had given him in hard times. He imagined Mary, watching her son suffer, unable to intervene. It wasn't a grand theological idea that moved him here, but the simple, painful reality of a parent's love. Further along, the group stopped where Simon of Cyrene was forced to help Jesus carry the cross. Jonathan had always thought of Simon as a side character, almost forgotten in the larger story. But standing there, he realized how vital that moment was. Without Simon's help, Jesus may not have reached Calvary. Jonathan wondered how often he had overlooked people in his own life who had helped him shoulder invisible burdens. At another station, they remembered Veronica, the woman who offered her veil to wipe Jesus' face. A small plaque showed her holding the cloth. Jonathan thought about how small the gesture was, just a piece of fabric offered in compassion. Yet tradition remembers it 2 millennia later. It reminded him that acts of kindness, however ordinary, can echo far beyond the moment. The final stations took the group into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. By then, Jonathan felt the weight of the journey, not physically, but emotionally. Each stop had been a window into suffering, love, and sacrifice. Walking through the crowded streets, unnoticed by passers-by, gave him a new perspective. The cross was carried not in isolation, but in the midst of daily life. People had been buying bread and bargaining over goods while Christ dragged his cross past them. That realization unsettled him. How often did he go about his own life, blind to the suffering of others just a few feet away? By the time Jonathan reached the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the streets had narrowed even more. Crowds pressed in from all sides, tour groups following guides with raised flags. Orthodox monks in long black robes, families clutching candles. The entrance itself was almost hidden, tucked between stone walls and arches. But once he stepped inside, the space opened up into a vast, echoing hall. The air smelled of incense and wax. Dim light flickered from hanging lamps, casting long shadows on ancient stone. Jonathan felt overwhelmed at first. The church was crowded, noisy, and layered with different chapels built by different traditions. Greek Orthodox, Catholic, Armenian. It was confusing to navigate, but the guide explained, beneath all the layers of history and architecture, 2 things remained unchanged: Calvary and the tomb. The group climbed a steep staircase to the right, which led to Golgotha, the hill of crucifixion. At the top was a chapel with a golden altar, candles burning, and mosaics depicting Christ nailed to the cross. Beneath the altar was a hole, cut into the floor, where visitors could reach down and touch the rock of Calvary. Jonathan watched as pilgrims bent low, sliding their hands through the opening, some pressing their foreheads to the stone, others weeping quietly. When his turn came, Jonathan knelt. The rock was cold under his hand. He tried to imagine the cross standing here, the weight of Christ's body, the crowd shouting insults. It was hard to picture amid the gold and marble, but the physical act of touching the stone made it real. He thought of the words carved above Jesus' head that day. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." What must it have felt like to stand here, watching him die? From Calvary, the group descended to another section of the church, the tomb itself, the edicule, a small shrine. stood in the center of the rotunda, surrounded by pilgrims waiting in line. Its walls were darkened by centuries of smoke, and its dome glowed with light filtering through windows above. Jonathan joined the line, inching forward slowly. Pilgrims whispered prayers, clutched rosaries, or sang softly in different languages. The weight felt heavy with expectation. Finally, he entered the tomb. The chamber was small, barely enough room for a handful of people. A stone slab covered the spot where Jesus' body was laid. Jonathan bent down and touched it. It was smooth from centuries of hands, cool to the touch, yet warm with the presence of so many prayers. He had imagined this moment for years, but standing there, he felt something different than he expected. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was quiet in that silence. Jonathan thought about Holy Saturday, the day after the crucifixion, when the world had gone still. He realized how hard it must have been for the disciples, not knowing resurrection was coming. Waiting in silence, unsure of the future, is one of the hardest things in life. Jonathan knew that feeling well, waiting for medical results, waiting for answers to prayers, waiting in uncertainty. The tomb, he realized, wasn't just about death. It was about waiting in faith, even when nothing seemed to be happening. Leaving the tomb, Jonathan stepped back into the crowded rotunda. He looked up at the dome above, where beams of sunlight streamed down like reminders of Easter morning. Around him, people crossed themselves, knelt, or simply stood in awe. Jonathan didn't feel the need to say much. The tomb spoke for itself, empty, silent, yet filled with hope. For him, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not just a holy site, it was a lesson. Suffering and death were real, but so was the promise of resurrection. The rock of Calvary and the empty tomb were only a few steps apart, yet they carried the entire weight of the Christian story. After days in Jerusalem, Jonathan's group traveled north to the Sea of Galilee. The contrast was immediate. Gone were the narrow, crowded streets and constant sounds of the city. Here, the air was fresh, the water calm, and the hills rolled gently into the distance. Jonathan stood on the shore early in the morning, watching the sun rise over the lake. The surface shimmered gold, and for the first time on the trip, he felt completely at peace. The guide explained that most of Jesus' public ministry had happened here. Nearly 90% of his miracles, parables, and teachings took place along this shoreline. But for Jonathan, one story mattered most: Peter's restoration after the resurrection. Peter had returned here to fish. He had denied Jesus 3 times in Jerusalem, and now, weighed down with guilt, he slipped back into his old life. But on this very shore, the risen Christ met him again. Beside a charcoal fire, Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" and gave him the mission to feed his sheep. The group walked to the site known as the Primacy of Peter. A simple chapel stood by the water, with flat stones leading down into the lake. Jonathan bent down and touched the rocks, imagining the scene, the smell of smoke from the fire, the sound of waves, the awkward silence as Peter faced the one he had denied. Jonathan thought about the weight Peter must have carried, and how freeing it must have been to hear Jesus say, in effect, "You still belong to me." As Jonathan reflected, he thought of his own regrets, times when he had disappointed people he loved, or moments when he had felt like a failure in faith. Standing there, he realized that Peter's story wasn't just about the past. It was about second chances. Jesus didn't end Peter's story with failure. He gave him a new beginning. Jonathan sat quietly by the water, letting the sound of gentle waves sink in. It struck him that restoration doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. Peter's denial was remembered, but so was his forgiveness. That gave Jonathan hope that his own failures could be turned into something new. Before leaving, the group prayed together, asking God to renew their commitment to follow him. Jonathan whispered his own prayer, for strength to be more faithful, for courage to carry his cross, and for grace to begin again when he stumbled. Looking out over the Sea of Galilee, Jonathan felt something stir in him. This wasn't just the end of a tour. It was the beginning of a renewed journey of faith. The same waters that once carried fishing boats and echoed with Christ's voice now carried his own prayer. A desire to keep walking forward, despite weakness, toward the one who had called him.